In the winter of 1846 to 1847, a group of American pioneers became trapped by snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They were trying to reach California, chasing the promise of a better life. Instead, they found themselves facing starvation, freezing temperatures, and impossible choices. By the time rescuers reached them months later, nearly half of the 87 members of the Donner Party had died, and the survivors had done the unthinkable to stay alive. They had resorted to cannibalism. This is the story of the Donner Party, one of the darkest chapters in the history of American westward expansion. The year 1846 was the height of westward migration in America. Oregon fever and California fever had gripped the nation. Thousands of families were selling their farms, packing their belongings into covered wagons, and heading west in search of fertile land, gold, and opportunity. The journey was long, over 2,000 miles from Missouri to California, and dangerous, but the promise of the West was irresistible. The Donner Party was named after brothers George and Jacob Donner, prosperous farmers from Springfield, Illinois. George was 62 years old, relatively wealthy, and looking for a fresh start in California. He traveled with his wife, Tamsin, and their 5 daughters. Jacob traveled with his wife, Elizabeth, and their 7 children. The Donner families were the backbone of what would become the ill-fated party. Also among the group was James Reed, a successful businessman from Springfield, traveling with his wife, Margaret, and their 4 children. Reed had designed a massive 2-story wagon called the Pioneer Palace Car that was more like a mobile home than a typical covered wagon. It had beds, a stove, and even a library. It was luxurious but heavy, and it would prove to be a liability. The Donner Party left Springfield in mid-April 1846. They joined larger wagon trains heading west, following the established California Trail. In the beginning, the journey was relatively pleasant good weather, adequate supplies, and the excitement of adventure. The group consisted of about 87 people, including men, women, and many children. But from the start, there were tensions and problems that would foreshadow the disaster to come. The first major mistake was made in July 1846, when the party reached Fort Bridger in present-day Wyoming. They faced a choice: continue on the established California Trail, which was longer but well-known and relatively safe, or take a shortcut. The shortcut was called the Hastings Cutoff, named after Lansford Hastings, a promoter who had written a guide to California and claimed to have discovered a faster route. The cutoff would supposedly save the travelers 350, 400 miles and weeks of travel time. Sounded perfect. But Lansford Hastings had never actually traveled the route with wagons. He had traveled it on horseback and had grossly underestimated the difficulties wagons would face. The route went through some of the most difficult terrain in the West, the Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake Desert. Despite warnings from more experienced travelers, James Reed convinced most of the party to take the Hastings Cutoff. It was a decision that would doom them. The shortcut was a disaster from the start. In the Wasatch Mountains, there was no real trail, just dense forest and steep terrain. The men had to cut a path through thick brush and trees, sometimes making only a mile or 2 of progress per day. Wagons broke down. Tempers flared. Valuable time was lost. Then came the Great Salt Lake Desert, an 80-mile stretch of barren, waterless alkali flats. The crossing was supposed to take 2 days. It took 5. Oxen died of thirst and exhaustion. Wagons were abandoned. Supplies were lost. The party was disintegrating. By the time they finally emerged from the desert and rejoined the California Trail, they had lost a month. Instead of saving time, the Hastings Cutoff had cost them crucial weeks. And now it was late September, dangerously late in the season, to be crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains. The tensions within the group exploded into violence. On October 5th, James Reed got into an argument with one of the teamsters, John Snyder. The confrontation turned physical, and Reed stabbed Snyder with a knife, killing him. It was arguably self-defense, but emotions were running high. The group voted to banish Reed from the party. He was forced to ride ahead to California alone, leaving his family behind with the wagon train. By late October, the Donner Party was running behind schedule and low on supplies. They were approaching the Sierra Nevada mountains, the final major obstacle before reaching California. If they could cross the mountains before the heavy snows came, they would make it. But timing was everything. They didn't make it. On October 28, 1846, the party camped near what is now called Donner Lake, at the base of the Sierra Nevada. They were exhausted, low on food, and their oxen were weak. They planned to rest briefly and then make the final push over the mountain pass. That night, it began to snow, and it didn't stop. A massive early-season snowstorm dumped several feet of snow in the mountains. The pass, which normally would have been passable, became impassable. The snow was too deep for the wagons. The grade was too steep. The weather was too severe. The Donner Party was trapped. They were stuck at approximately 6,000 feet elevation in the Sierra Nevada mountains with winter closing in. They had inadequate food, inadequate shelter, and no way forward or backward. The snow kept falling. By mid-November, there were 6 to 8 feet of snow on the ground, with drifts much deeper. The party split into 2 main camps. Most of the group, about 60 people, camped near the lake in crude cabins they hastily built or took over from previous travelers. This became known as the Lake Camp. The Donner families, whose wagons had broken down earlier, were camped about 5 miles away at Alder Creek. They had even less adequate shelter, just tents and makeshift lean-tos. This was the Alder Creek Camp. As November turned to December, and December turned to January, the situation became desperate. The snow continued to fall. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and the food ran out. They slaughtered their oxen and cattle for meat. But those supplies didn't last long, with 87 people to feed. They tried hunting, but game was scarce, and the snow was too deep to travel easily. They ate hides, boiling them to make them barely edible. They ate bones, roasting them and grinding them up. They ate twigs, bark, anything they could find. People began to starve. The elderly and the very young were particularly vulnerable. Bodies began piling up, frozen in the snow because the ground was too hard to dig graves. And then someone suggested the unthinkable, eating the dead. The exact timeline of when cannibalism began is unclear and disputed. The survivors were understandably reluctant to talk about it in detail afterward. But based on journals, rescue accounts, and later testimony, we know that by late December or early January, some members of the Donner Party had begun consuming the flesh of those who had died. It started with a small group called the Forlorn Hope, 17 people who attempted to snowshoe out of the mountains to get help. They left the lake camp on December 16, 1846. They had virtually no food, inadequate gear, and were walking through deep snow over treacherous mountain terrain in the middle of winter. It was a desperate gamble, and it became a nightmare. The Forlorn Hope struggled through the mountains for over a month. They got lost. They ran out of food. People began dying of starvation and exposure. On Christmas Day, 1846, far from help, starving and hopeless, the survivors made a decision. They would eat the dead. The first to be consumed was a man who had died of starvation. The survivors cut meat from his body, roasted it, and ate it. Some could barely force themselves. Others were too far gone to care. It was cannibalism born of absolute desperation. Eat or die. As more people died, more bodies were consumed. There are accounts of people specifically refusing to eat their own family members, but eating others. The Forlorn Hope trudged on, sustained by the flesh of their dead companions, until finally, on January 18, 1847, the 7 survivors stumbled into a Native American settlement. They had been in the mountains for 33 days. Of the 17 who had set out, only 7 survived. The others had died, and in most cases, been eaten. The survivors told their story, and rescue parties were organized to reach the remaining Donner Party members trapped at the lake and Alder Creek. But it was already too late for many. Back at the camps, conditions had deteriorated beyond imagination. By January 1847, starvation had set in completely. People were dying regularly. Bodies were stacking up. And those still alive faced the same terrible choice the Forlorn Hope had faced. Eat the dead or join them. Cannibalism became more widespread at the camps. Some survivors later admitted they had eaten human flesh. Others never spoke of it. The accounts are fragmentary and often contradictory. People were traumatized and ashamed, and they wanted to forget. What we know is that some of the dead were consumed. Bodies were mutilated. Human remains were found by rescuers showing evidence of having been processed for meat. The survivors had crossed a line that society considered unforgivable, but they had done it to survive. The first rescue party reached the lake camp on February 19, 1847, nearly 4 months after the party had been trapped. They found scenes of horror, starving people living in filthy, frozen hovels, bodies partially buried in snow, evidence of cannibalism. The rescuers were shocked and sickened. They could only take a few people out at a time, primarily children, and those strong enough to walk. The journey back over the mountains was brutal. The rescuers had limited supplies and the snow was still deep. Some who left with the rescuers died on the trail. 3 more rescue parties followed over the next several weeks, each evacuating more survivors. The last rescue party reached the camps in April 1847. By then, almost everyone who was still alive had been brought out. The final toll was devastating. Of the 87 people who had been trapped by the snow, 48 survived, and 39 died, a death rate of nearly 45%. The deaths were not evenly distributed. Of the 15 men over age 20, only 2 survived. Of the 12 women over age 20, 10 survived. Children had mixed survival rates depending on age and family situation. The higher survival rate for women has been attributed to several factors. They typically had more body fat to sustain them through starvation. They were more likely to stay in camp, conserving energy, while men attempted to hunt or explore. And there are suggestions, disputed, that women were more willing to resort to cannibalism when necessary. The survivors who emerged from the mountains in the spring of 1847 were skeletal, traumatized, and changed forever. Some had lost entire families. Some had eaten their own relatives to survive. All had witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Among the dead were George Donner, 62, died at Alder Creek. Jacob Donner, 56, died at Alder Creek. Tamsin Donner, 44, stayed with her dying husband, died at Alder Creek. Many of the Donner children, numerous other adults and children from the party. Among the survivors, James Reed's entire family survived, thanks in part to food he sent back after reaching California. Several of George Donner's daughters survived. Members of the Breen family who kept a diary documenting the ordeal. Individuals whose survival stories became legend. The story of the Donner Party spread quickly. By the time survivors reached San Francisco and other California settlements, newspapers were already reporting on the disaster. When the full details emerged, including the cannibalism, the story became a sensation. The survivors faced both sympathy and judgment. Some people understood they had done what was necessary to survive. Others were horrified and considered them moral monsters. The stigma of cannibalism followed some survivors for the rest of their lives. Several survivors wrote accounts or gave interviews in later years. The most detailed contemporary account was the diary kept by Patrick Breen, one of the survivors. His entries document the daily deterioration of conditions, the deaths, and the growing desperation. He mentions people dying almost casually by the end, as death became routine. The Donner Party disaster had several causes, and understanding them helps explain how things went so wrong. 1. The Hastings Cutoff decision. This was the fatal mistake. Taking an untested shortcut through difficult terrain cost them a month and put them behind schedule. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, it was too late in the season. If they'd stayed on the main trail, they would have crossed the mountains weeks earlier and avoided the snow entirely. 2. Poor leadership and decision-making. The party lacked strong, unified leadership. Different people gave different advice. Decisions were made by committee, slowly and often poorly. James Reed, who had pushed for the Hastings Cutoff, was banished before they reached the mountains, removing one of the few decisive leaders. 3. Inadequate preparation. Many in the party were inexperienced pioneers who didn't understand the challenges they would face. They brought inadequate supplies, especially food. Their wagons were often too heavy and ornate, like Reed's palace car. They didn't have proper gear for mountain travel in winter. 4. Bad timing. They left too late in the season and were further delayed by the Hastings Cutoff. The established wisdom was to reach California by October. They didn't reach the Sierra Nevada until late October, dangerously late. 5. Bad luck. The snowstorm that trapped them was unusually early and severe. If it had held off for another week or two, they might have made it over the pass. Nature is unforgiving, and timing is everything in the mountains. 6. Internal conflict. The group was riven with personality conflicts, arguments over leadership, and the violence, the killing of John Snyder, that led to James Reed's banishment. United groups survive better than divided ones. The Donner Party disaster became a cautionary tale and a dark legend in American history. It demonstrated the dangers of westward migration and the thin line between civilization and savagery when survival is at stake. The site of their ordeal, now called Donner Memorial State Park, sits near Interstate 80 in California. There's a monument there and a museum documenting the tragedy. Thousands of people drive past every year, most unaware of the horror that unfolded there in 1846 to 47. The Donner Party raises profound ethical questions. Was cannibalism justified? From a pure survival standpoint, yes, they used already dead bodies to sustain the living. No one was murdered for food, though there are disputed claims about this. They were facing certain death and chose to survive using the only resource available. But from a moral and cultural standpoint, it was a profound taboo violation. Even today, cannibalism is one of the few universally condemned acts across all cultures. The survivors knew this, which is why many never spoke of it. Could it have been avoided? Absolutely. Nearly every decision that led to their fate was avoidable. Different choices at multiple points would have prevented the disaster. That's what makes it so tragic. It was entirely preventable. Who was responsible? There's no single villain. Lansford Hastings deserves blame for promoting a route he hadn't actually tested. James Reed deserves blame for convincing others to take it, but mostly it was a collective failure of judgment, preparation, and timing. The legacy of the Donner Party is complex. As a cautionary tale, it illustrated the dangers of the westward migration and the importance of preparation, timing, and sticking to established routes. As a survival story, it showed both the best and worst of human nature, incredible endurance and will to live, but also the lengths people will go to survive, including violating the deepest taboos. As an American legend, the Donner Party entered American folklore as the ultimate story of pioneers gone wrong. It's referenced in popular culture, taught in schools, and remains one of the most well-known disasters of the westward expansion. As a historical lesson, it demonstrates how quickly modern people, when stripped of food and shelter, can be reduced to primitive survival mode. The distance between civilization and savagery is shorter than we like to think. The survivors went on to live varied lives. Some prospered in California. Some struggled with trauma and social stigma. Most kept quiet about the worst details of their ordeal. A few became public figures, giving lectures or writing about their experiences. The children who survived carried the trauma their entire lives. Though many went on to have families and successful lives, the resilience of the survivors, their ability to rebuild after such horror, is as remarkable as their survival itself. Today, historians and archaeologists continue to study the Donner Party. Excavations at the campsites have uncovered artifacts, bones, both animal and human, and evidence that helps piece together exactly what happened. The story continues to fascinate because it touches on fundamental questions about human nature, survival, and the limits of endurance. The Donner Party's ordeal lasted from October 28, 1846, when they were trapped, to April 1847, when the last survivors were rescued approximately 5 months. 5 months of starvation, cold, death, and choices that would haunt the survivors forever. 48 people survived. 39 died. And those who lived did so by crossing a line that humanity has drawn since the beginning of civilization. They ate human flesh to stay alive. History judges them harshly in some ways, sympathetically in others. But anyone who considers what they endured must ask themselves, what would I have done? How long could I have lasted? Where is my line? The Donner Party faced these questions in the winter of 1846 to 47, trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and their answers became legend. Rest in peace to the 39 members of the Donner Party who died in the mountains, and respect to the 48 who survived by doing the unthinkable. The story of the Donner Party is a reminder that the American West was won at a cost, and that sometimes that cost was paid in the darkest currency imaginable.